There are many famous statements that come to us from church history, and a lot of them are familiar to people who aren't specialists in church history at all. I'll start out a sentence, and I'll see if you can finish it. This one very famous saying, "The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church." Have you heard that? The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. Now, I hate to break it to you, but one of my purposes in this class is to dispel myths. Okay? Now, it is true that Tertullian said something like that. He didn't technically say that, but he said something close to it. What Tertullian actually said is the blood of the martyrs the blood of Christians is seed. The blood of Christians is seed. And over time, people elaborated on it, said, well, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. Well, this is what Tertullian technically said. The more often, we are mown down by you, the more in number we grow. The blood of Christians is seed. When we are condemned by you, we are acquitted by the highest. Tertullian, we've talked about him as being one of the early Christians who was an apologist. If you remember, 2 weeks ago, we talked about the Apostolic Fathers. And they were the group that immediately followed the apostles, guys like Peter, Paul, John, James, these others. They kind of took the baton and ran with it the next leg for about 120 years. And then following them, there was a group known as the Apologists. And their job was to defend the faith. So the Apostolic Fathers were just trying to find their feet. You know, what does it even mean for us to not be Jewish anymore, but to take on this new identity of Christian? That was the Apostolic Fathers. The Apologists said, why don't we proactively spread the faith and propagate the faith and defend it philosophically and theologically in these other ways? That was the era of the Apologists. And Tertullian was one of those. Now, Tertullian, he made this claim in a book of his in the year 197, as Christians were facing repeated waves of persecution. What we're going to see in a few minutes is that the persecution in the early church was sporadic. It wasn't just a block of 200 or 300 years of day after day persecution. It wasn't that bad. We don't want to exaggerate how bad it was, but we also don't want to minimize how bad it was, because at times it was extraordinarily severe. Last week, if you were here, you might remember that we looked at the odd blessing of heresy. Who can define heresy? What does that word mean, heresy? Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's a good basic definition of it. Heresy is a teaching or a claim that contradicts what God has said in His Word, right? So that's kind of an easy way to think of heresy. It's a little bit more technical than that, but that's basically the idea. And last week we saw that it was actually a blessing that different people rose up and started to teach things outside the kind of the orthodox, the standard Christian teaching. And what was the blessing that we saw of heresy? What's the basic idea there? What did it force Christians to do? Right, exactly. So when Marcion and when Montanus and the Gnostics, as they were claiming, well, this is the true spirituality over here, the mainline Christians were saying, wait, that's actually not what we believe, because that's not what God's Word says. And so heresy forced the church to come out clearly and state what it actually believed. Now, this morning we're going to look at another blessing in disguise, and this really is a blessing in disguise, but it's the blessing of persecution. The blessing of persecution, which the early Christians faced. Now, sometimes when we think of the early church, we can think that Christians were constantly in hiding. They were always on the run from the authorities, from the Roman emperor and Roman armies and things like that. That every week Christians were in the situation that we saw here at the beginning. That every week they were being thrown to the lions. Now that's not true. Thankfully, that's not true. It wasn't quite that bad. But what we do see is that over a period of about 250 years, starting with the Apostle Paul and Nero. We're going to see in a few minutes that we believe the Apostle Paul was killed by the Emperor Nero. Starting with that date in about 64 AD, all the way until the year 312, 313, at the time of Constantine. Over those 250 years, there were about 10 significant persecutions that Christians faced. So there's kind of a window of time there, and the end date being the Constantine and this edict, which was known as the Edict of Milan, which made Christianity legal. Now, it's very important that I say that he made Christianity illegal. We're going to go off on a quick rabbit trail, okay, because it's very important. Did Constantine make Christianity the official religion of the empire? Did he? He did not. He did not. Constantine legalized Christianity. This is a bronze statue of Constantine in York, in northern England, about an hour from where we lived for a few years. Constantine was actually baptized in England, in York, far away from Rome, at his conversion. Did he make it the official religion of the empire? No, he didn't. The Roman Catholic Church teaches that there's a thing called deadly sins. I don't believe in deadly sins. I don't believe that in like mortal sin or venial sin. I believe that every sin is deadly, right? No matter how big or how small, it's offensive in God's eyes. However, in church history, there are some deadly sins. And one of them is claiming that Constantine made Christianity the religion of the whole Roman Empire. Okay? So in my class, that's one of the 7 deadly sins, okay? We'll come to some others a little bit later. It is not true that Constantine made Christianity the official religion of the empire. In fact, even PBS, public broadcasting, you would think it would be very reputable and historical, reads that in 313, the Emperor Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, which accepted Christianity. 10 years later, it had become the official religion of the Roman Empire. That is false. That makes historians want to pull their hair out when they just think, how is this possible? In fact, if you Google, when did Christianity become the official religion of the empire, it will pop up the year 313 with the Edict of Milan. That is not true. Before 313, it was illegal to be a practicing Christian. And all Constantine did was make it legal to be a Christian. That's very different from saying this is the religion of the empire. Now, it was 70 years later, in the year 380, that the Emperor Theodosius I did actually make Christianity the official religion of the empire. So that did happen, but it was not under Constantine. It was later under an edict called the Edict of Thessalonica. So think of it in this way. I hope you'll at least remember this, and it'll be fun to correct people because you'll hear this from time to time. Under Constantine, Christianity was legalized, not empirized. That's not a word, but you get the point, right? It was legalized, but it was not empirized. Now, as I said a moment ago, within these 10 persecutions that happened over a period of how many years? 250 years, right? You have 2 distinct phases of persecution, okay? The first phase was between the years 64 AD and 250 AD. So in that big block of time, you had about 6 major persecutions. And in those cases, the persecutions were not empire-wide. They were sporadic and local and random almost, where for a certain season, there would be persecution that would go against the Christians, but just in a localized area. It wasn't empire policy. But then in the second half, the second block, from the year 250 AD until the year about 305 AD, is when you had several persecutions that were empire-wide. And it was the purpose of the Roman emperors to eradicate Christianity. When you read these accounts of the blood that was shed, it's unbelievable at how horribly the Christians were treated in these days. So let me give you the list of 10 persecutions, and we'll just hit some of the highlights. We're not going to laboriously go through every one. This is a picture of recent persecution in 2016 of Christians today. But if we look at this list, it starts in 64. These are all Roman emperors, by the way. Nero, Domitian. Starting with Nero, 64, Domitian in 95. Then under Trajan, Hadrian, and Antonius Pius, you had another kind of outbreak of persecution. Later, under Marcus Aurelius, if you've seen The Gladiator, Marcus Aurelius is sort of like the great emperor. Well, that was certainly not how the Christians felt. He was very opposed to Christianity and opposed them. Oh, we got renumbered here, didn't we? Anyway, that should read 1 through 10. Then in the last couple were under Septimius Severus and Maximus Thrax. So these first 6 were kind of in the random, sporadic phase of the persecutions. And it was these last 4 when, as an empire-wide policy, the purpose was to eradicate Christianity, kill Christians wherever you find them if they don't sacrifice to the state gods and things like that. So we'll come to that. But let's start with Nero, the first persecution. Now this is going back into the days of the apostles, right? We think that John, the apostle John, who wrote the Gospel of John and was the dear friend of Jesus, we believe he died about the year 98, 99, 100, somewhere in there. So going back a few decades into the 60s, you had the Emperor Nero who was in charge. He was a pretty dastardly guy. He was a pretty wretched guy by all accounts, not just in his behavior toward Christians. But Tertullian and Lactantius were two people who claimed that Nero was really the first to implement serious persecution of Christians. He was a despicable guy by all accounts. We believe he was guilty of matricide. What is matricide? Killing one's mother. It's like Like, if you can only do one thing in life, you can at least be nice to your mom, right? Well, he wasn't down with that, right? He killed his mom is what the evidence suggests. Now, I think most everybody has heard the expression, Nero fiddled while Rome burned. Have y'all heard this? You remember back in 7th or 8th grade, whenever you learned kind of world history, Nero fiddled while Rome burned. There's debate about whether that's true. This is kind of a picture of that, him fiddling or listening to music while his city is in flames. A lot of people today, a lot of professional historians, they say, this is a myth. It's not true. It could be true. We're just not sure. My own personal view on this is so often historians, they run out of things to write about. And so then they just think it's fun to try to dispel myths or to say, well, this is a myth, this isn't true, that sort of thing. So it certainly would have fit his character. Well, in the year 64, there was this massive conflagration, an enormous fire that broke out in Rome. Here's a little bit of the background. Nero, he dreamed up the construction of a series of palaces that would cover 1/3 of the area of the city of Rome, and he was going to modestly name it Neropolis. Okay, so what this involved, if he was going to be able to build Neropolis, he knew that he was going to have to knock down all the homes and the buildings in this huge portion of the city. Now, the Roman Senate, they opposed him, and they said, Nero, you're out of your mind. We're not going to knock down all these people's houses and everything like that. And so the rumor is that Nero started the fire. He said, well, I'll kind of get things going. Now, from Nero's perspective, it's hard to blame him. I mean, if you think it's hard to get a permit in Miami-Dade these days, think about a permit in Rome to just wipe out 1/3 of the city. So he said, "Well, let's see if we can help the process a little bit." And so on July 19th of the year 64 A.D., this fire broke out. It ended up destroying 10 out of 14 districts of Rome. So there's a lot of loss of life. It was really a horrible thing. Now, it's possible that Nero started the fire, but it is positive that he tried to blame it on Christians. Right, so he used them as the scapegoats. Right, he said they were the ones who started it. Now, this is what Tacitus, the Roman historian, wrote. He wrote that not only did Nero pin the blame for the great fire on Christians. He clothed them in wild animal skins and had them torn to death by dogs. So he would take the hides of animals and pin it on Christians, and he would throw them in the arena, and then they were torn to death by dogs and other animals. One of the most grisly and just awful accusations against Nero that there is some merit to is that he would take these sort of linens, and he would douse them in oil. Then he would wrap Christians in them. He would crucify them, and he would set them on fire. It's a little bit hard to see here in the graphic, but that's what's happening there. And this was to provide light for his gardens. So he would have these, horrible, just horrible. But it was to provide light for his parties and his gardens. And so can you imagine being a citizen of Rome and coming to one of Nero's parties, and you have burning Christians up and down the length of his gardens? Absolutely horrible. Now the accusation against these Christians was that they held fast to the name. What name do you think that was? Jesus. Yeah, they said, "You're Caesar, you're not Lord. Jesus is Lord." That was the accusation against them. And so tradition, and I think it's a pretty good tradition, says that the Apostle Peter and the Apostle Paul were killed in Rome and under Nero. That the Apostle Paul was beheaded and that Peter was crucified upside down at his death. But who has had the last laugh? Well, there's a historian by the name of Glover who wrote these words about Nero's condemning the Apostle Paul. Listen to what he wrote. "The day was to come when men would call their dogs Nero and their sons Paul." Have you ever met a dog named Nero? Well, yeah, people do it. If we ever get a dog, we'll probably name him Nero. Well, that day has come. That day has come. We name our sons Paul. We name our dogs Nero. Now, the second persecution, we won't spend any time on. It was the year 95, Domitian. But there is one kind of interesting guess that as that persecution broke out in the year 95, this was around the time John wrote Revelation. And so when you read these grisly images of the treatment and the persecution of Christians, there's a guess that John had in the back of his mind. He's thinking about Domitian, the emperor at the time, that Domitian was one of these persecutors of the saints. But that is a little bit of speculation. Now, the third major persecution really gives us some insight into what was happening. This is Trajan, the next Roman emperor, and it was under Trajan and then Hadrian and Antonius Pius. From these years, for about a 50-year period, 112 to 165, that you had several waves of persecution that came against Christians. There was a governor in Bithynia whose name was Pliny the Younger. And Pliny noticed that Christians are multiplying everywhere. You know, this Jewish sect was the way they thought of it. He said it's multiplying. And Pliny wrote a letter to Trajan. He said, "How should I deal with the Christians? Right? Should I treat them as loyal subjects to Rome? Should I persecute them? What should I do?" Well, in this letter that was written in the year 112, we get some significant information. It's interesting that in this letter written in the year 112, it's the first time that a pagan writer is referring to the Christians, right? So outside biblical sources, a reference to this group of Christians. And this is what the Emperor Trajan, this is how he replied to Pliny. He said, "Well, don't seek Christians out for trial. So don't go looking for them, right? Secondly, if the accused are guilty of being Christian, then punish them. Thirdly, if the accused deny they are Christians and show proof they are not by worshiping the gods, then pardon them. Let them go. And lastly, I think this is at least fair. He said, don't allow anonymous accusations." So these were kind of his 4 points. This is how to handle this group of Christians. This is how to deal with them. Trajan also decreed that there needed to be 2 witnesses, And what you would do if someone was credibly accused of being a Christian is they would be brought before the local judge, Pliny certainly would have been one of them, or a magistrate, something like that, and then told that you must sacrifice to the gods of Rome. Present this sacrifice, offer this incense to this or that god. And if the Christians, or if the person who was accused, if they did it, then well, that's fine. You're not a threat to the state, right? And so we'll let you go. But Pliny and Trajan knew that a true Christian would never do that. They would say, I can't. That would be denying my Lord. That would be denying my master. So this was their strategy for rooting out Christians. This is what was written. If the accused denied that they had ever been a Christian, then once they had prayed to the Roman gods in words dictated by Pliny himself, offered incense and wine to images of Trajan and the gods, and cursed Christ, which Pliny rightly says true Christians are unable to do, then they were discharged. Accused who were at one point Christians but had quit the religion also followed the aforementioned procedure and were let go. Those who confessed to being Christians 3 times were executed. So they would ask repeatedly them to renounce Christ, and if they didn't, then they were killed. If you remember the apostolic father Ignatius of Antioch, remember we talked about him 2 weeks ago. He was killed at this time. He was thrown to the lions in Rome in the Colosseum during the reign of Trajan. And another apostolic father, Polycarp. You remember he said, "Jesus has been faithful to me for 86 years. I'm not going to deny my Savior who has purchased me." You remember him, Polycarp? It was during that time, this time as well, later in the year 155, that he was executed. Let's look at the next persecution under Marcus Aurelius. This is fairly brief. This one, although we do have some interesting detail about Justin. This is the execution of Justin Martyr. Remember, he's another one. He was one of the apologists. He was also executed. At his birth, his name was not Martyr. That was added later. Okay, I mean that would be quite a burden to bear your whole life. What's your name? Justin Martyr. Well, I wonder how he's going to die. It wasn't like that. He was given the name later. Now, as I mentioned, you who love the movie Gladiator, and I think it's one of the best movies ever. It's very, very good. In that movie, the idea is Marcus Aurelius is the hero. He's the most wonderful emperor. He certainly was a very powerful emperor, but he was no friend of Christians. In fact, who's the really evil emperor in that movie? Commodus. Remember, Commodus was just the useless son played by the guy, what's his name? Joaquin Phoenix. You remember him screaming, "Am I not merciful?" Yeah, anyway, chilling. Well, the reality is that in truth, Commodus was actually lenient on Christians. You know why? He was so indifferent and just lazy and was only interested in pursuing his own pleasure that he just didn't even bother the Christians. So he was merciful. I guess we could say, yes, you were very merciful because you were too busy just pursuing your pleasures and things like that. It was in the year 177 that Marcus Aurelius, who came before Commodus, went after the Christians, and especially in a place called Lyon, which is in France. It's still a city in France today. Residents of Lyon sent a letter to fellow Christians in Asia Minor, and they described these 48 Christians who had been martyred, who had been executed in France, including the bishop of the city. Justin Martyr, as I mentioned here, he was beheaded. He was executed in the year 165. Welcome. This is a very child-friendly lesson. In the year 165, during the reign of Marcus Aurelius. And if you remember a couple weeks ago, I ended by saying something about his martyrdom. You remember that when it came time for Martyr to be executed, he pled for his life. But why? For their sake. It wasn't for his sake. He had no problem with going and being with Christ. He begged them. He said, "Don't kill me. God will judge you for this. He's going to hold this against you." So he begged that they wouldn't kill him for their sake, not for his sake. Well, listen to this account of the martyrdom of Justin. The prefect, who's like a magistrate or a governor, His name is Rusticus. He says to Justin, approach and sacrifice, all of you, to the gods. And Justin said, no one in his right mind gives up piety, we'd say godliness, for impiety or ungodliness. He had no idea about the year 2018, right? No one in their right mind gives up godliness for ungodliness. Rusticus says, if you do not obey, you will be tortured without mercy. And Justin said, that is our desire, to be tortured for our Lord Jesus Christ, and so to be saved, for that will give us salvation and firm confidence at the more terrible universal tribunal of our Lord and Savior. And all the martyrs said, do as you wish, for we are Christians, and we do not sacrifice to idols. Rusticus said, those who do not wish to sacrifice to the gods and to obey the emperor will be scourged and beheaded according to the laws. Then it says, the holy martyrs, glorifying God, they took themselves to the customary place where they were beheaded and consummated their martyrdom, confessing their Savior. I don't think Justin is saying, if you kill me, that will give me salvation. That would be like an Islamic type thing. But rather, when you kill me, that means salvation for me. If you remember, when I was kind of advertising for this class in front of the church and trying to get everybody to come, you remember I told the story about a mother hiding her son's clothes. Do you remember that? Any of you remember that? I asked the question, why did a concerned mother hide her son's clothes so that he wouldn't go outside? And there was a lot of puzzled looks then, just as there are right now. Well, this comes from the next persecution, the fifth major one, under Septimius Severus. In the year 202, the emperor, Septimius Severus, he issued an edict which forbid anybody from converting to Judaism or Christianity. You kind of group the two together, and he ordered execution for anybody who was openly practicing Christian. Under him, the persecution was very heavy in North Africa. There's a lot of Christians in North Africa up until the Muslim conquest in the 7th and 8th centuries. And this is where Origen lived. So this is kind of this funny story from church history. Funny in sort of a weird way. When Origen was about 16 years old in the year 202, his father, Leonides, was arrested and beheaded for his Christian faith. Origen was outraged and tried to run outside so he could get arrested and killed just like his dad. But his mother hid his clothes, and Origen was too embarrassed to go outside naked. Origen's family's property was confiscated by the state, and Origen ended up becoming the breadwinner for his mom and his siblings. So it was not only we're gonna put you in prison, we're gonna torture you or kill you, but it was like we're confiscating all of your goods. So your family would become absolutely destitute. So you can see how this might weed out the people who are kind of the half-hearted, lukewarm Christians, wouldn't it? You know, or those who would say, well, there's easy forgiveness, right? I'll just say, oh yeah, I'll burn this idol to, this incense to some false god, but I'm sure there'll be forgiveness later, Well, this was became a very serious issue for the early church. Now, earlier I said that AD 250 was a dividing line. You remember? It was sporadic, random, and local for the first segment of time. But now, for the next 55 years, from 250 to 305, about that changes. And this started under Decius. There's an inscription of him on a Roman coin. Decius. The first widespread attack, all-out, empire-wide attack on Christians happened in the year 250 and 251 under the Emperor Decius. What he did is he commanded everybody to sacrifice to the gods. So you'd be brought, if you were known to be a Christian, or anybody, in fact, had to sacrifice to the ancient, kind of the traditional gods of Rome. And if you refused, you would be executed. That was the punishment. You see, in these centuries, most Romans were syncretistic. Who can define syncretism? What does that mean? Syncretism. That's right. Yeah, kind of blend, a hodgepodge. It's like, well, I'm a Christian. Yeah, I'm definitely a Christian. But I also like these gods. I want to appease them. I want to make sure they're not going to come after me. And I'll take a little bit of this other god over here. Classic, like Hinduism today in the East, would be very syncretistic, right? Well, true Christians were not syncretistic. And so they were not willing to have Jesus and then also to sacrifice to all these other gods, right? And so this became a great problem for them. So this is what's written about Decius. All the inhabitants of the empire were required to sacrifice before the magistrates of their community, quote, for the safety of the empire, by a certain day. When they sacrificed, they would obtain a certificate called a libellius, recording the fact that they had complied with the order. That is, the certificate would testify the sacrificiant's loyalty to the ancestral gods and to the consumption of sacrificial food and drink, as well as the names of the officials who were overseeing the sacrifice. So this is a picture of this. The idea is when you come before the magistrate and you offer a sacrifice to whatever Roman god they were wanting you to sacrifice to, you got a little sheet of paper called a libellius, right? And so people would hang on to these as proof that they were with the program, with the Roman Empire program, you know, that they were loyal to their country. Well, true Christians were unable to do this. They wouldn't do it. And there's a horrible instance of a woman whose name was Agatha, who fell under the power of Rome and was executed during the Decian persecution. She had vowed herself to a life of celibacy. She said, I can serve God better unmarried. Well, there was a Roman official, kind of a low-level administrator, who fell for her. And he said, no, I think you're going to marry me. And she refused. And so he brought charges against her that she was not with the state program and that she was a Christian. And when she was charged with being a Christian, she prayed this way: Jesus Christ, Lord of all, you see my heart. You know my desires. Possess all that I am. I am your sheep. Make me worthy to overcome the devil. I mean, isn't that a beautiful prayer? When I read things like this, I feel my soul attached to a Christian I've never met, don't know anything about except for this. But it's like this person is speaking about the same Lord as the one that I love, even though many hundreds of years ago. And then it's written in this account that this official, Quintinianus, sent for her again, argued with her, threatened her, and finally he had her put in prison and had her tortured. She was stretched on a rack, torn with iron hooks, burned with torches, and whipped. Unbelievable. Unbelievable what Christians went through. When I had my wisdom teeth out a week and a half ago, I thought I was going to die. What a wimp. I mean, come on. You know, I can't imagine this sort of thing. One bishop of Rome, who is called Pope Fabian, we're going to see in another week or two that there wasn't really this idea of popes until much later. But the Bishop of Rome, named Fabian, he was killed at this time. Many Christians were killed, but many apostatized, right? To apostasy means to turn away from the faith and to say, you know, that rack looks pretty painful, and I'm good. I'm in line with Rome. Let's do a little detour for a minute. This is called an excursus, okay? Here's the question. Let's discuss this for a minute. Is it legitimate to persecute people for their beliefs? Why or why not? How about we'll just do a poll. We'll be very American. Raise your hand if you think it is legitimate to persecute people, like harm them, and even like torture them and kill them for their beliefs. Raise your hands. Okay. All right. Oh, boy. All right. You were a man out of your century. Anyway, no one. You don't think that's okay?
I think there are times when, not necessarily persecute, but you've got to challenge their beliefs anyway.
Oh, sure. But what about active persecution? Bringing call Rick and have him arrest them, put them in jail until they give up their beliefs. Yeah. And what this means is that all of us are modern people. All of us are modern people. I think it's likely none of us have ever even really had a debate with somebody over this, where someone's saying, yeah, I think you should compel by force, if necessary, to try to get people to change their beliefs. Now, if we want to understand history rightly, and we want to understand the past, you know what you have to do if you want to be sympathetic and really get a deep understanding of all, you have to go back and put yourself in their shoes and ask yourself, why were they thinking this way? Okay? Like, is it possible they actually had good reasons for believing that compelling people was a legitimate option? Does that make sense? I think we have to. Otherwise, we'll just look at them and say, well, y'all are insane. We are the only enlightened ones who have ever existed. Now, that's very, very, very arrogant, right? Now, I'm not saying I'm going to try to talk you into, like, let's compel people, right? If people don't show up for Easter, we're going to have them arrested, you know? Don't worry, I'm not going there. But I want us to get in this mindset and ask this question. Because until about 200, maybe 300 years ago, nobody would have failed to put their arm up and say, yeah, it's okay to compel people to believe certain things, right? So it's true that we're really products of our time. I think a lot of it is good, but let's explore this for a moment. Why did people think it was okay to persecute for belief for thousands of years? Persecute someone for certain beliefs that they held. Well, in the days of the Roman Empire, there were two reasons that actually make a lot of sense, okay? The first is this. If you are worshiping the wrong gods, you might be putting the empire in danger by arousing the anger of the gods. And we know that was a charge of atheism. If you refuse to give homage to the whole panoply of Roman gods, you were an atheist, right? You remember when Polycarp said, away with the atheists, right? So for the Romans they genuinely believed that there were all these gods. And it's like, if you're not on board with the program, then it could be you. You could be the reason that the gods have turned their favor away from us. And so it's you that's causing all these assaults to come against the empire. Now, I hope we all disagree that this is a good thing, because there's an assumption in there that I hope, would reject. What is the assumption that we would reject? That there are all these gods, that these are real gods, right? These are either no gods or these are demonic, right? I mean, that's what the New Testament says. So I hope we disagree with that. But at least you can see, I hope, that if this is true, then it makes sense. Like, well, look, hey, we'll kind of twist your arm a little bit, but that's for the good health of the whole empire. Can you understand the logic there? The second reason is that the empire and religion were linked. Now, it's like become this axiom in America for many people that say there is separation of church and state, right? So whether we won't even debate, the merits or the demerits of that for now, but people assume that today. But in an empire where the empire was linked with religion, crimes of belief were actually crimes against the empire. Right? So if you believe the wrong things, you are guilty of treason, okay? Because the empire is linked with some of these beliefs. So here again, can you understand the rationale of why it might be legitimate to persecute and to harm because somebody was holding the wrong beliefs? Now, if I have persuaded you that these are right things, then I have failed miserably, because I don't agree with these things, okay? I mean, there's no amount of torture, no amount of harm you can do to anybody to change their heart, right? And that's all that God cares about, okay?
Even in the Roman Empire, they were supposed to worship the emperor.
An emperor worship, right?
He was supposed to be a god. So if you didn't worship him, that went against the state. And then if your allegiance was to something other than the emperor,
right,
then you could be against that. And then even today, under like the communist system, if you have an allegiance to God, then you don't have an allegiance to the state.
That's right.
Then you can be considered treasonous for.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, the state in that schema, the state sort of takes on the role of God, and it's by definition atheistic because of that. Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. Yes.
I don't want to fall into the category, but like when you see things on TV about the cults that we see that are a form of religion, right?
Yeah.
We do want to force them to stop some of their practices, and we have.
Right. Yeah.
In the Mormon, churches and things like that. So.
Right. Yeah.
We're not forcing them to believe necessarily, but that's what they're doing.
That's exactly, and there's the distinction, is the distinction between belief and what you're doing, right? So if someone's beliefs say, yeah, I think it's okay to torture people, like, okay, well, you're doing it because of your belief. We're not going to stop you. You can have that belief, but if you act on it, that's when the law comes against you. So I think there's kind of that distinction there. And so with this question, like, this was purely about belief, and the Romans were saying, prove to us your beliefs by whether or not you will sacrifice to these different gods. Now, just one little note here about Emperor Decius and why the persecution happened is that the year 248. So right around this time, the year 248 was the 1000th anniversary of the founding of Rome. And after Marcus Aurelius passed away in the year 180 AD, gradually the empire was on a slow but a steady decline. And Decius had seen this happening for 70 years, and he said, surely it is the fault of the Christians that we're now in this gradual decline. And so he wanted to put an end to it. Many pagans held that the neglect of the old gods who had made Rome strong was responsible for the disasters which were overtaking the Mediterranean world. And then Tertullian said this. This is a little bit funny in kind of an odd way, but Tertullian wrote, the populace think the Christians are the cause of every public disaster, of every affliction with which the people are visited. If the Tiber, that's the main river running through Rome, if the Tiber rises as high as the city walls, if the Nile does not send its waters up over the fields, if the heavens give no rain, if there is an earthquake, if there's a famine or pestilence, straight away the cry is, away with the Christians to the lions. Very sad, but that was the way people thought at the time. When we get to Augustine a little bit later, I can't wait to get to Augustine, we'll learn that in the year 410 AD, the city of Rome was sacked. That, you know what that means? Like conquered, overthrown by the Visigoths and a commander by the name of Alaric. And in light of this, I mean, trauma like you cannot even imagine. It would be like the Canadians with their mounted horses coming in and taking over Washington, D.C. or something like that. You know, I mean, it was only much more traumatic than that. People were saying this is because of the Christians. And Augustine, for 26 years, he wrote a book by the name of The City of God. And this was Augustine's apologetic, his word back, his reply to the Roman pagans who were accusing the decline of the empire, or blaming the decline of the empire on the Christians. So that's what the City of God is about. Well, the Decian, in light of all this, the Decian persecution, it was pragmatic. It wasn't necessarily a principled attack on Christians. Well, let's hurry through to the end. The eighth major persecution was under Valerian. Cyprian was a very influential bishop in North Africa. He was beheaded in this wave of persecution when Valerian reinstated Decius's measures from about 5 or 6 years before. He reinstated those measures against Christians. This one poor man, a Christian by the name of Lawrence, he was roasted on a gridiron, which must be an absolutely awful way to die. We save the worst for last, really. This was under Diocletian, the 10th persecution from the years 303 to about 305. This was an all-out crusade against Christians. Churches were destroyed; they were burned. At the point of a sword, houses were visited by soldiers where the Christians had to hand over the scriptures. They became known as those who said, all right, here, you can take my copy of the Bible or this letter of Paul or one of the Gospels. They became known as the traditores, those who hand over, right? So you have to give up your scriptures. We're burning your churches down. All Christian officials were removed from office. He wanted to neuter Christians, to cause them to have no power whatsoever. And household servants who were working in Christian homes, so workers in homes, became slaves of the empire. And in 304, Diocletian added bloodshed to the misery. One Christian town in Asia Minor was surrounded by soldiers, and they set it on fire, and they killed every single person in the town. Is it possible that blessings could come out of persecution? Is that possible? That was how we started out our time. And I think that's true. And one of those, we've already hinted at, is that the main benefit to the church was that persecution tended to separate the weaker and lukewarm members from those who were truly committed, right? Faced with this sort of persecution for a long time, and persecutions will continue after this era, certainly. I'm sure there's a lot of that on the horizon for Christians now. And I think in the future as well that it's going to have the same effect. It's going to separate those who are truly committed to Christ from those who are just sort of conveniently, yeah, sure, I'm a Christian. Yeah, I love Jesus. I don't want to go to hell. Sure, I'm a Christian. Yeah, count me in. I think this has over time. It has separated true Christians from those who are not, who are just Christians for convenient reasons. Now, these persecutions, they create a scenario that we're going to return to a little bit later. One question arose given that some Christians held fast and suffered while others renounced the faith. And it's this question, were the churchly actions of pastors, think of someone like me, were the churchly actions of lapsed pastors legitimate? So, for example, does a wedding or a baptism need to be redone if the minister who conducted that ceremony renounces Christ and under the threat of persecution says, oh no, I'm not one of those Christians. Sure, I'll burn the incense. I'll offer the sacrifice. Were the actions of those pastors null and void? So that's a question that the church is going to have to face. It's actually going to become a very big issue. We'll come to this with Augustine. And eventually there was a whole splinter group. I don't know if we'll get to them. I'll mention it now. But there's a group called the Donatists. And the Donatists said, we alone are the true church because the mainline church is infected. You've got some pastors that were faithful under persecution, and you've got other pastors who apostatized, who turned away and renounced Christ in the persecution. And so the Donatists said, we need a pure church, right? We don't need a lot of big sinners in the church, right? So that was their goal, and they broke away from the mainline church, and they became known as the Donatist church. It became a very, very big issue later in church history. Now, it is interesting if we go to the only really important text, namely Scripture, and think about this. Through these awful persecutions, Christians were just getting what Jesus had promised in John 15. Remember, we looked at that several months ago in the sermons. Jesus had said, if the world hates you, know that it has hated me before it hated you. Remember the word that I said to you, a servant is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will also persecute you. Jesus is saying, I am your master. I'm over you. I'm above you. You're not greater than me, and yet they've persecuted me. So why would you think that if they persecute your master, they're not going to persecute you who are my followers? Jesus said, don't think that way. You can expect that this is coming. We know that Jesus also promises at the same time comfort and peace through trials. Like Jesus promises that there will be suffering if you're going to be my faithful follower, but I also will be with you and I will comfort you through all of those trials that you endure. There's a very poignant verse in Revelation 12 where it speaks of those who are martyred for the faith. John writes, I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have come. For the accuser of our brothers has been thrown down, who accuses them day and night before our God. And they have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. For they loved not their lives even unto death. Do you love not your life even to the point of death? In other words, is it really the case that your love for Jesus is bigger than your love for your own life? That's the question for us. And I admit it's very easy in this very comfortable room to say, yes, I would stand fast. I hope and I pray that I would. I pray that God would give me grace to stand fast. But would we really? I hope that with his help, we would. Now, by the mid-300s, I'm going to close with this. By the mid-300s, major persecution was mostly a thing of the past. So after Constantine turned Christianity into the official religion of the empire, no. After he legalized Christianity, there was no need, no reason. It would have been wrong for the Roman authorities to track down Christians or punish them. But nevertheless, there were occasional outbreaks of persecution. In fact, there were even a couple of truly pagan emperors of Rome who tried to re-implement some of this persecution. One of those who did persecute Christians was named Julian. He became known as Julian the Apostate. He was the last pagan Roman emperor. All the other ones after him were Christians, at least nominal Christians. He fought against Christianity. He tried to rekindle persecution in 355. He was killed on the field of battle when he was 32 years of age. And listen to his dying words. One author writes this: both Christian and pagans believed the rumor that he cried out when dying, "Thou hast conquered, O Galilean." Who's the Galilean? The Lord Jesus, of course. And that's a good lesson for his age. That's a good lesson for ours and for all of the ages to come until Jesus comes back. That we worship, we love, and are committed to honoring the strange Galilean carpenter named Jesus Christ. A lesson for the ages. There is no Sunday school next week. So if you're here, you feel free to come. You can have a nice time, but we won't see you. I won't. Because next week is Easter. So make sure you don't come next week for Sunday school. Any questions? We've got about 3 minutes. Yes, Doug.
When Constantine legalized Christianity, was there some kind of an explanation that accompanied that? I mean, obviously, he would have been going against a lot of common thought. If these actions are dangerous in the sight of Roman God, he would have had to undo a lot of cultural thought.
Yeah.
So, was there an explanation, or just an edict, and he had to get along with it? Or?
Yeah, he had an experience of going into battle. I think it's called the Milvian or Milvian Bridge in Rome. He was about to go into a battle, and he had a vision. It was a dream or something like that. A vision. It was conquer through this, and it was the symbol for Christ. And then he won the battle, and that was when he was supposedly converted. The kind of the broad answer, that was when he came to faith, and it was right around that time. I think it was the year 310, right before he came into power. But essentially, as the Roman emperor believed, so the empire believed. Okay? Now that in no way means that everybody who said, "Oh, sure, I'll be a Christian," that was actually a legitimate thing, that these people were true, disciples of Jesus and born again and those sorts of things. So yeah, it was a process. I mean, it didn't happen overnight. I mean, here we've got Julian the Apostate who, a couple of decades after Constantine was still clinging on to that paganism. So I don't think those ideas died overnight. I think it took time. And even when, after 380, when Christianity was the official religion of the empire, by no means did that mean everybody was a Christian. But it was more, the empire is moving in this direction of kind of the Christianization of the Roman people. So I think that took time. And I think there was a lot of syncretism that happened in the empire for centuries until really the collapse and the fall of Rome in the 5th century. So yeah, that's my best guess there. So any other questions?